Hello, I'm Don Fries.
And Bev Bow, welcome to our kitchen. We're excited to make for you today a sun-dried tomato mushroom quiche. I think there's some other
Spinach tofu.
Spinach tofu quiche.
Hello, Bev and I are going to take turns on some of the steps of this quiche process. I'm going to be making the crust, and the first thing to do is mix a tablespoon of ground flaxseed in with 3 tablespoons of water, because that actually takes a little bit of time. So I'm going to whisk that in with this little device here, and then we'll do some other mixing while we're waiting for this to gel up a little bit, because it does take a little bit of time.
Yeah. One thing I might mention is that this flax water mixture is often used as an egg substitute. And in this case, it's just used to give some body to the crust, but because it does form a kind of gel when you want egg as a binder, this is a really good substitute.
So because we have a 10-inch pan, and you all may have a 9-inch at home, but the recipe that we're going to use uses just slightly more. The first thing we're going to do with this pan, and this is a kind of a Pyrex pan, when we eat avocados, Bev actually takes the peel and freezes it. So we have a number of these in the freezer, but as you'll notice, there's always a little bit of avocado left inside, and it makes a great pan oiler or greaser, or whatever you want to call it, without using actual processed oil. This still has, the residual avocado still has the phytonutrients and the fiber that's in natural avocados. So it's a much better thing to use as a grease substitute.
So this recipe uses 14 ounces of tofu. I like to use the extra firm, and this actually says it has 15.5, but close enough. And I like these packs. I like also the Wildwood or organic tofu. It's made with sprouted soy, and so you get a little more nutrients with that, but really any firm soy will work. And I do like these that come in the split packs. We're going to use both of them today, but lots of times I only need half this much. You'll have a recipe that calls for 7 or 8 ounces. And that way the other half stays good, because tofu does go bad in the fridge relatively quickly. One thing that I find that helps keep it is if you can, even when you put it in the fridge, if you cover it with water, and whatever your container is, has to be deep enough that it actually covers it, then it will keep longer. So I'm just going to, what we want to do with our tofu is get as much of the water it's packed in out of it as we can. And a common method that you'll see in recipes is to actually wrap it after you drain it, which we'll do here, is to wrap it in a tea towel, and oftentimes they'll recommend that you put like a stack of books on it or something. I rarely do that, but I do find that it's useful sometimes to take a clean tea towel, which is what I actually have 2 layers here, and wrap it up, and then I just put a little pressure on it. I'll push on it, and that can, if you do that, you can squeeze most of the extra moisture out of it. And then we're just going to let that sit, and it comes later in our recipe. But meanwhile, we'll be soaking up that extra moisture.
Okay, now we're going to move on with making the crust, and it actually consists of, this recipe, about a cup. Since we're using a 10-inch pan, we found that about a cup and a quarter of oat flour and a cup and a quarter of whole almond flour. So that's what's in these. We're going to mix those together in this mixing bowl right here.
And one thing I might say about that is I happen to have both oat and almond flour in the fridge, but if you don't, you can just take almonds and you can take rolled oats and run them through your blender or food processor. And actually doing that with the oats gives it a little bit coarser texture to the crust, which I actually like. It's, you know, just kind of like an oatmeal cookie or something. So feel free to do that if you don't have oat flour, just make your own.
So then what we'll mix in with that flour mixture is a teaspoon of dried parsley and a teaspoon of dried oregano. So that goes in there. Basically you just take a fork and mix those spices and the flours together really well. Take just a second. And once we get this done, I'm going to go ahead and pour in the mixture of ground flax and water that we just talked about a little bit ago. And it is now gelling, has been gelling as we've been doing some of these other things. So it still has plenty of moisture in it, but you can see it's gelled up quite a bit. So in it goes, and we're going to need a dash more water anyway, and I just happen to know that from doing this before. So I'm just using that just slight amount to rinse in.
Actually, I think.
And I'll probably need the remaining water that's there, but I'm going to start out with just a little bit. And I think this was about, what, 2.5 tablespoons or teaspoons?
Actually, for the 1 1/4 cups of
Yeah, almost a tablespoon.
of flour, I put 4 tablespoons of water in there because the recipe, this is one of those recipes that had oil in it, and because we cook without oil, I've just substituted, and in this case I've substituted a little more water in the crust, and it comes out just fine. And so we don't put the oil in as indicated.
Yeah,
we use
as
water
indicated.
instead. And this is one of those things where you go by feel, and if it's you want it to feel kind of like not quite as sticky as cookie dough, but more like a pie crust kind of feel. So as Don works it there, he'll be able to tell, and if he needs to add a little more water, he can. It's easier to add more than to take it out, so you just do a little at a time.
Yeah, it's starting to crumble together, much like pie dough. I think I'm probably going to need a little bit more water, so I have a little bit more here that I can put in. We're getting there. The next thing we're going to do, as soon as we have this already greased with avocado pan, and I'm going to put that in there sort of equally distributed around, but especially a little bit in the middle initially, because the way you do this crust is you work from the inside out, and you try to get an even thickness from the inside, and then work your way towards the edges, and then not only toward the edges but actually up the outside edges. It's getting, yeah, it's pretty much there. Just a little bit flaky, but it feels like it's going to be a good pie. Oh, we're making quiche. Oh, anyway. So anyway, you just distribute these around the edge, and starting in the middle, get the rest of the flour in there, and then start working it gently from the middle towards all of the edges, and then up the side. You can focus on the sides a little bit later, but right now It's just getting a thickness. I would imagine it's about 1/8 of an inch thickness. And interestingly, I noticed when we baked it before, it seemed to just get just ever so slightly thicker after, when we baked it, which was kind of an interesting phenomenon. That's where. Okay, we're just about done with the forming of the crust for the quiche. And what I've done is worked from the inside out towards the edge of this 10-inch pan. And as I got to the outside, I pulled the crust up around the perimeter just a little bit, because when we put the quiche filling in here, it's going to be deep enough that it'll rise up pretty much to the edge of this edge, which is roughly, I don't know, 3/4 of an inch to an inch high. And we're just about to put it into the oven for 15 minutes at 350 degrees, which will pre-cook the crust. I use the fork basically to put a few holes in the bottom of the crust, and so it doesn't develop air bubbles while it's in the oven. And so now Bev's going to demonstrate some things with regard to the filling itself, and I'm going to go ahead and put this in the oven.
Okay, so back to our tofu here, which, as you see now, it's really, if I squeeze on it, it really doesn't have any water coming out. So I'm just going to put it in the food processor, break it into a few pieces here. And what we want to do is just process it long enough to make it a nice creamy texture, because that's going to be your the main base of this quiche. So, just going to let it go. Helps to scrape the sides down at least once in this process. And you can see it's pretty thick here. If you find it's too thick for your processor, you can just splash a little almond milk or whatever kind of plant-based milk you have into it, but very little. I think that should do it. You can see it's this really nice kind of creamy texture now. So we're just going to set this aside and go on with the rest of our filling process now. Okay, it looks like our quiche crust is done baking, so Don's going to pull it out.
All right, 15 minutes have passed and we're ready to go. So I'm going to pull this out. And smells good, looks good, and we're gonna
just set it aside to cool a little bit. Wow.
Then we're gonna put the filling in, and you'll see that in a minute. Do you want to say anything about the additional filling? Okay.
Just set it here to cool. And now we're going to change the temperature on our oven to 375, which is the temperature that we'll bake the quiche at.
Right. Okay, Bev now will demonstrate the filling.
All right, I want to show you this great little kitchen gadget that my friend Peggy gave to me, and I love it because I don't really like mincing garlic. So I put 4 cloves of garlic in here. The recipe calls for 3 large ones. Mine weren't that large. And actually the first thing I did, which you haven't seen, is I put the garlic down and kind of smashed it a little bit with the bottom so that it just peels right off easily. Then you just put them in here.
Show them the teeth on that thing.
Yeah, it has little teeth on both sides. And you put it in there and just go like this, back and forth. But obviously you can do this with a knife too, but I thought you might like to see this cool little tool. And then what you can see here is your garlic's all chopped up, and you kind of just position it so that it's in 2 little piles there. And we're just gonna stick it into our frying pan. Isn't that nifty? I think the reason I don't really like mincing garlic is it gets your hands so sticky, and this way that doesn't happen. So, you know, when I first started cooking whole food plant-based meals, I was pretty careful to follow the recipes all the time because I didn't have a lot of confidence. And these days I substitute a lot, so you'll see a couple substitutions here. The recipe calls for either leek or onion. We're going to use onion. I just don't have leek. And we put those in there. And the original recipe called for oil. This is a recipe by the person that does the Oh She Glows website, Angela Liddon, great cook. She uses oil often, and I just substitute. So I'm just going to put a little bit of water in there, probably about a 1/4 cup, a couple teaspoons to a 1/4 cup, and we'll turn the stove on a little bit above medium and get these going. And what we're going to do is just saute those until they start to soften, and then we'll start to add in the other things. So one of the other substitutions I'm making is I didn't have spinach, and I didn't want to go to the store, so I had some kale, and I've cut that up fine, and I think it would be just fine. The recipe also calls for chives, which I did have, but lots of times I don't. It just, luckily, since this is early October, we're, you know, it's a great harvest season, and I do have chives and basil in the yard, so I do have chives, but when I don't have them, I just use green onions, and they work fine for this recipe. Okay, you can maybe see what's happening here in the pan. We're starting to get a little going, and you know, with onions, usually just want them to start to get a little transparent. So garlic, and in this particular recipe, I like slicing them in rings, so you have the bigger rings. You could just chop it up into little pieces, but I kind of like the look of the rings in there.
Should you put in the garlic later, or, you know, sometimes people say garlic is quicker to...
Yeah, I mean, a lot of recipes have you put it in at the end, because I think that's a good point, Donna. It holds the flavor, but this particular recipe has it sauteing with the onion, so
okay.
That's what I'm doing. All right, so we're getting them kind of all separated and transparent. And then I think the next thing is the mushrooms. Let me look. Turn that down a little bit. Right, and then add a little bit of water. Now, we don't use salt much in cooking, a little bit sometimes, but one thing that salt does in this recipe, if you sprinkle a little bit, it draws the water out of the mushrooms, which is something you want to do. So I am going to put a little bit on here because we want to pull that water out.
Smells pretty good.
It does. I wish you could be here to smell this. I wish you could smell the basil. It's getting a little limp now, but I pulled this out of the yard today. Ooh, it smells so good. So you just have to imagine. I used to go to a particular farmer's market that was just infused with the smell of basil. So whenever I smell it, it takes me right back to the Hollywood Farmer's Market in Portland, Oregon.
That's where Bev and her all-woman band, her marimba band, played.
That's right. Puts me back into the music mood. Okay, so this is getting most of the water cooked off. There's still a little bit there. You can see how it drew the water out of the mushrooms. And again, I think the recipe calls for criminy mushrooms. I didn't have them, I had white mushrooms. So, you know, use what you have. These days, I never actually do like going to the grocery store, but I especially don't like going to the grocery store right now where, you know, there's all the COVID worries and you need to wear a mask and everything. So if I can avoid it, I'll just put something else in my recipe. Oh yeah, lots of water coming out of that still. And one other thing I might mention, so this has sun-dried tomatoes in it. Again, the recipe originally called for the ones packed in oil. I don't buy those at Whole Foods, and I think at Natural Grocers too, you can get them in a little bag, a little pack, and they're just the tomatoes. They're not packed in anything. And so normally, if that's what I had gotten, I would have pre-soaked those in some water till they got soft, and then taken them out and chopped them up because they're full-size tomatoes. We happen to have these lovely little cherry tomatoes that we dried from our garden. And so I don't have to chop them up. And don't you love the color of those? The ones you get from the store are usually get kind of a dark red, but these are just this lovely bright red.
And they're very sweet.
And they're very sweet, yes. More sweet actually than the ones that that you would get from the store. Okay, so now we put in our herbs, our chives here, our basil, we're going to turn the heat down a little bit. Let's see, what else? You want to put the tomatoes yeast and everything else. So this is our kale masquerading as spinach. Nutritional yeast. Sun-dried tomatoes. You can see this is where we get this lovely color. And then what do we have? We have a little bit of oregano. A teaspoon of oregano here. Some black pepper. I'll just kind of eyeball that. And some red pepper flakes. So use this depending on what your own tastes are. You can put in none or a lot. We'll put in some. And then it does call for salt. I'm going to put in probably half of what it calls for. So just a little bit to bring out the flavor, but not I think it calls for a whole teaspoon, and we put in about 1/3 of a teaspoon there. Okay, so you cook it just until the spinach, or in this case kale, is wilted. And I don't know if you can see the lovely colors here, the green and red. And then we'll turn our heat off, and what we're going to do is stir in the tofu that we creamed up earlier. And we're just going to mix that all together. It's thoroughly combined. How's it smell?
Delicious, and the whole room smells like a spicy,
Herbaceous.
place.
All right.
All right, time to put it in the...
I'm going to put it in that beautiful crust you made.
So there it is, the preformed, pre-baked crust, which will hold it all.
And then we just, you can see it's pretty thick, so we just spread it out here. And again, all these nice colors and textures show through. All right, into the oven with it.
All right, here we go. Remember, this is 375, and how long are we going to leave it in there?
I think it stays in for, let me look. You bake it for 33 to 37 minutes. And then ideally what you do is you take it out and let it cool for about 15 to 20 minutes before you slice it. So we're just gonna let that cook and smell it cooking. Okay, it looks like we're done baking, so Don's going to take it out of the oven and
Here we are.
let's see what we've got.
After 35 minutes at 400 or 375 degrees, let's have a look. Oh, and the basil really comes out.
Oh, that looks lovely.
So I'm getting hungry already. I'm going to put it over here on the hot folder.
We'll let it cool for just a little bit and then we'll slice it.
Okay, now the moment
All right, are you hungry?
we've all been waiting for. I am really hungry.
All right.
And we're going to have
Right. Well, what's the verdict?
the basil is outstanding. And it's all the flavors mixed together very nicely. So, bon appetit. Here's looking at you.
Willie wants some too.
That can be a postscript.